We have been in these mountains for 10 stories now. We have sat in stands that were built by something other than human hands, on ridges above familiar creeks. We have followed blood trails that were made rather than fallen into timber that nobody should have walked into. We have heard the call from the northern drainage, and we have sat still and not answered because the founding members of a 90-year-old club knew something we are only now beginning to understand. We have found what 3 shed hunters found on Iron Mountain in March: the grove, the rings, the fresh shed facing outward, and we have understood what it meant to have been seen by something that had been keeping its own records while we were keeping ours. We have stood at the Dunmore family's white oak and understood that 4 generations of that family had been sharing the most intimate space on their farm with something that had a prior claim and the patience to wait 100 years before making an introduction. We have listened to Blue tell Luther Phelps to come down off the Fancy Gap Ridge. We have looked through 60 years of glass at what Carl Larkin saw every season from his stand above Galax. We have knelt in the rain in a thicket in Patrick County and said the words over a deer that something else had been inside. And through all of it, through every stand and every thicket and every clearing and every lane, we have been circling the same question. Not what are these things? We have established what they are. They are old, they are patient, they are present in these mountains with a depth and a completeness that makes our centuries of hunting here look like the first few pages of a very long book. The question we have been circling is this: why? Why do they walk the lanes and tend the herds? Why do they turn the shed antlers to face the people who find the grove? Why do they leave gifts on the meat pole and answer questions through 60-year-old glass? Why does something that has been here since before the mountains had names choose again and again to make itself known to the people who are paying attention? What do they want from us? A wildlife biologist named Sera Odom spent 3 years asking that question. She found the answer in the 1987 harvest records of Grayson County, Virginia. And the answer changes everything. This is the empty season. Virginia, blood and bone. The last story. Pay attention to the end.
The 1987 deer harvest records for Grayson County, Virginia were not unusual in any obvious way. The county-wide harvest that year was within normal range, slightly below the 5-year average, nothing that would have prompted investigation. The weather had been variable, the herd population was stable, and the season had proceeded without incident. Except in one section. The 12-square-mile block in the northeastern quadrant of the Jefferson National Forest, a section bounded by 3 Forest Service roads and the county line to the north, had produced exactly 0 harvest in 1987. Not low harvest, not poor harvest, 0. 81 licensed hunters had entered that section during the season. Not one had reported a deer taken. 11 had reported deer seen. 70 had reported deer sign, tracks, scrapes, rubs, the evidence of a healthy, active herd, without seeing any deer at all. The DNR biologist who reviewed the data the following spring noted the anomaly, ran a population comparison against the surrounding sections, found no evidence of disease, predation pressure, or habitat disruption sufficient to explain a complete harvest failure, and wrote in his report, "Anomalous season in any quadrant, cause undetermined, monitoring recommended." Monitoring was not continued. The file was closed. And every year since 1987, the deer sign in that 12-square-mile section has been the heaviest in the surrounding forest, not by a small margin, but by a factor that the trail camera data in recent years had made impossible to ignore. The section supported a deer population density 2.5 times the county average. The antler quality was extraordinary, the heaviest racks, the oldest bucks, the healthiest does. By every wildlife management metric, it was the richest deer habitat in the county. and almost no one hunted it. Not because access was difficult, the Forest Service roads made it accessible. Not because the hunting was poor, the sign alone would have drawn serious hunters from across the state. Because the hunters who had been in that section in 1987 had not come back. And the ones who came after them and went in once came out without having taken a shot, and did not come back either. The section had been, for 35 years, effectively unhunted. It was called, in the informal vocabulary of Grayson County hunters, the dead zone, not because nothing lived there, because something about it made hunters come out empty-handed and unwilling to return. Sera Odom was 31 years old, a wildlife biologist with the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources when she was assigned to the Grayson County section in 2022 as part of a broader deer population assessment project. She had a master's degree from Virginia Tech and 3 years of field experience in the Blue Ridge, and she had not heard of the dead zone before she reviewed the historical data. She reviewed the historical data on a Tuesday afternoon in her office in Wytheville. She pulled the 1987 records first because 35 years of consistent anomaly in a specific geographic section was not a random fluctuation. That was a pattern, and patterns had explanations. She intended to find the explanation. She did not expect the explanation to be what it was.
She spent the first 6 weeks of the project conducting interviews, specifically interviews with hunters who had been in the section in 1987 and with hunters who had entered it since and not returned. She found 17 of the original 1987 hunters still living in Grayson County. She found 11 more from subsequent seasons who had hunted the section once and had not gone back. She told me that the interviews were the most unusual research experience of her professional life. Not because the hunters were difficult or uncooperative, they were helpful. They answered her questions completely and without evasion. The unusual quality was how consistent they were. 28 separate interviews, conducted individually over 6 weeks, and the accounts converged to a single description with a precision that she had not encountered in any wildlife behavior research she had previously done. The consistent elements, drawn from all 28 interviews. 1. The deer were present. Sign everywhere, the heaviest sign any of the 1987 hunters had encountered on any Grayson County ground. Every hunter confirmed the deer were in that section. 2. When hunters saw deer, the deer were wrong. Not obviously wrong, not dramatically wrong, wrong in the specific way that May Sutherland described a deer as wrong. Wrong in the eyes, wrong in the proportions, wrong in the way they stood and the way they moved through the timber. Every hunter who had seen a deer in the section described the same wrongness in different words, but the description beneath the words was the same. 3. No one fired. Not one of the 81 hunters in 1987, not one of the hunters in subsequent seasons who had entered the section had fired a shot at a deer in that section. She asked each of them why. The answers varied in their vocabulary but converged in their meaning. It didn't look right. Something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I wasn't going to shoot at something I wasn't sure of. I've been hunting these mountains 20 years and I've never not been sure, and in that section, I wasn't sure. She asked, sure of what? They said, sure it was a deer. She asked the question she had been building to since the second interview. She asked, did any of you see anything else in the section? Anything unusual that was not a deer? 14 of the 28 said no without hesitation. 6 said they were not sure, that they had a sense of something in the timber that they could not identify, that they had felt watched in a way they did not feel watched elsewhere in the forest. 8 said yes. The 8 who said yes took longer to answer than the others. They looked at her with the expression of people who had been carrying something for a long time and were deciding in this specific conversation with this specific person whether it was safe to set it down. She waited. All 8 set it down. All 8 described the same thing. Not the deer-shaped wrongness, something else.
something in the timber above the section at higher elevation that they had seen or sensed or felt the presence of. Something that was watching the deer the way a shepherd watched a flock, not hunting them, not threatening them, watching over them, moving with them through the timber at a distance that maintained the herd's calm while ensuring that no threat came close enough to matter. One woman, 73 years old, a deer hunter for 50 years, said, "I know what a predator looks like in the timber. I know how deer behave when a predator is nearby. What was moving in the timber above that section was not behaving like a predator, and the deer were not behaving like prey. They were behaving like—" She paused. Like they were protected. Like they knew they were protected and they weren't afraid because they knew something was there that wouldn't let anything bad happen to them. Sera wrote that down. She wrote down every word of every interview. Then she went into the section herself.
She spent 3 days in the northeastern section in November of 2022, the first day of that year's deer season. The sign was extraordinary. She had been in the field long enough to read it fluently. The depth and freshness of the tracks, the height and vigor of the rubs, the scrapes and their distribution indicating multiple mature bucks working the terrain. The deer were there, and they were healthy, and they were the best evidence she had ever seen of what a deer population looked like when it was completely undisturbed by hunting pressure for 35 years. She saw deer on the first day. 3 does and a buck in the first 4 hours, moving through the hardwood timber with the specific, unhurried confidence of animals that had no learned experience of humans as a threat. She observed them through binoculars. She did not raise a rifle. She was there as a researcher, not as a hunter, and she had her binoculars and her data sheet and her trail cameras. The deer were wrong. She saw it in the field the way every hunter she had interviewed had described seeing it. Not dramatically, not obviously, but present once you knew to look. The proportion of the body slightly off, the way they moved through the timber fractionally inconsistent with the weight and musculature their size implied. The eyes, when she had them in the binoculars, showing something that a deer's eyes did not normally show. She did not have a word for what the eyes showed. She wrote in her field notes, "Eye quality inconsistent with observed body condition and behavior. Further documentation required." She set up trail cameras at 6 locations on the first day and reviewed the footage each evening. On the second evening, she found what she had been looking for, and it was not what she had expected. The camera at location 4, set on a ridge above the section's center, facing down into a funnel between 2 drainages, had captured 47 deer in 24 hours. The herd was extraordinary, dense, healthy, exactly as the sign had suggested. And at 2:17 a.m. on the second night, the camera had captured something else. Not a deer. Moving through the funnel at the same travel route the deer had used, at the same pace, in the same direction, following the herd's overnight pattern northward through the drainage. The trail camera's infrared captured a thermal signature and a shape. The shape was not small. It moved with the specific, unhurried confidence that she had seen in the deer, the confidence of something that had no reason to be cautious in this terrain, not because it was a predator without competition, because it was home. It paused in the camera's frame for 11 seconds, facing up the drainage, facing the direction the herd had gone. Then it moved on. Sera sat in her tent at 9 in the evening looking at the trail camera footage on her laptop, and she sat with it for a long time. Then she went to sleep, which surprised her because she had expected to lie awake. She was not afraid. She would think about that for a long time afterward, why she was not afraid. The shape in the camera footage was not a bear, not a coyote, not a mountain lion, not any animal with a confirmed range in Virginia. It was something she could not identify, and it was large, and it was moving through this section of the Jefferson National Forest in the middle of the night like it owned the ground. And she was not afraid. She thought about that. She fell asleep. She stayed in the section for a 3rd day. She did not see the thing from the trail camera footage directly, but she felt it, the specific, familiar quality of being in a space that contained something aware.
Not the threat-adjacent awareness of a predator nearby, the awareness of a caretaker, the awareness of something that was attending to this section of forest the way a farmer attended to a field. She walked the section carefully, methodically, the way she walked all research ground, reading the terrain, reading the sign, building a picture of how the landscape was being used and by what. And she arrived, by the end of the third day, at an understanding that she described to me as the most significant conclusion she had reached in her professional life, and the most difficult to write in a way that the institution she worked for could receive. The section was managed. Not managed the way wildlife managers use the word, not the human practice of regulated harvest and habitat manipulation and population monitoring. Managed in the older sense, tended, maintained. The deer population in the northeastern section of the Jefferson National Forest had been under the active management of something for at least 35 years and almost certainly much longer than that. The wrong-eyed deer were not deer that had been possessed or occupied or taken over by something else the way May Sutherland's first deer had been occupied. They were deer that had been in long contact with something not human, that had been born and raised in a space where the largest presence was not a human hunter, but something else, and that showed in their eyes the way that cattle showed the presence of a farmer, not wild, not afraid, attended. The thing in the trail camera footage was not a predator and not a threat. It was the manager. The one who had been keeping this herd for purposes that 35 years of zero harvest had allowed to develop into something extraordinary. The highest quality deer population in the county, a gene pool undiluted by selective harvest pressure, a herd that had been allowed to develop according to some plan or preference that had nothing to do with human hunting objectives. The hunters of 1987 and every year since had been unable to shoot the deer in this section not because the deer were frightening or threatening, because experienced hunters in the moment before a shot had looked at those deer and had recognized, with the specific animal part of their brain that had been doing this longer than the rational part, that these deer were not theirs to take, that someone else had already claimed them. She sat in the northeastern section of the Jefferson National Forest on the evening of her third day, with the November light going gray through the hardwoods and the deer moving in the drainage below her, and she thought about everything she had found. She thought about the 13 stories she had read in the process of researching this project, the accounts from hunters across the Virginia mountains, the records going back decades, the patterns she had identified in the data. She had not expected the research to produce what it had produced. She had expected a wildlife anomaly with an ecological explanation. What she had found was a relationship. Something old enough to have been in these mountains since before the Forest Service existed, before the county was organized, before any human institution had a claim on this terrain, had established a relationship with the deer of the northeastern section. It had been managing them, protecting them, keeping them in this section, keeping them healthy, keeping them for what purpose she could not determine, because the purpose was not hers to know. And for 35 years, the hunting community of Grayson County had, without knowing it, without any instruction or tradition or rule being invoked, respected that claim. Not one shot fired. Not because the hunters were unable to fire, because experienced hunters in the moment before a shot had looked at what was in front of them and had known, with the oldest part of their understanding, that these deer were not theirs to take, that someone else had already claimed them. She wrote in her field notes, "The hunters of Grayson County have been observing an exclusion zone around the managed herd for 35 years without knowing they were doing it. The recognition that these deer were not available for harvest appears to have arisen directly from observation rather than institutional instruction. This is the most significant finding of this study. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote one more line. She wrote, "The hunters were right."
Sera Odom's formal report to the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, submitted in March 2023, documented the deer population anomaly in the northeastern Grayson County section, presented the historical harvest data, and recommended the section be designated as a voluntary no-harvest zone pending further ecological assessment. The recommendation was accepted. The designation was made. The section is now formally protected from deer hunting. The report did not mention the interviews with the 1987 hunters. It did not mention the trail camera footage from location 4. It did not mention what Sera had understood on the third evening in the section. She told me, "I couldn't write those things in a report that was going into the institutional record, not because they weren't true. Everything I found was true, but because the institutional context had no framework for what I had found, and putting it in a formal report would have resulted in either its dismissal or a level of scrutiny that the section didn't need and that I couldn't justify putting it through." "You protected it," I said. "I documented what I could document in a form the institution could act on," she said. "The section is protected now. The herd is protected. Whatever has been managing that section for at least 35 years can continue to manage it without interference. That was the outcome I needed." "And the thing in the footage?" I asked. "I kept the footage," she said. "I have it. I'm not going to publish it because publishing it would bring exactly the kind of attention to that section that I spent 2 years protecting it from." "What did it look like?" She was quiet for a moment. "Large," she said, moving with complete confidence in that terrain, not hurrying, not cautious, at home. She paused. It paused in the camera frame for 11 seconds, facing up the drainage, facing the direction the herd had gone, as if it was checking on them. Another pause, as if it was making sure they were all right before moving on. "Did it know the camera was there?" I asked. "I believe so," she said. The pause was 11 seconds. That is a very specific amount of time to stand in front of a trail camera, longer than an animal pausing naturally, shorter than an animal that intends to stay, exactly long enough for the camera to capture what it wanted captured. "It wanted to be on camera," I said. "I believe it wanted to be documented," she said, "the same way the founding members of Camp 4 believed it wanted to be acknowledged, the same way the things on these ridgelines have been making themselves known to the hunters who pay closest attention for as long as there have been hunters paying attention." She looked at her laptop, at the trail camera folder. It knew someone was finally looking at the data. It knew someone was finally asking the right question, and it made sure the answer was findable. I asked her, "What is the answer?" She looked at the window for a long time. "These mountains are not empty," she said. "They have never been empty. They were inhabited, deeply, completely inhabited, by things with a prior claim and a longer tenure, long before the first survey was run and the first deed was recorded and the first hunter walked into this timber. And those things have been managing these mountains and the deer in these mountains and the relationships between the deer and the hunters and the land for longer than any of us can accurately measure." "They've been allowing the hunting," I said. "They've been managing it, the same way they manage the deer. The 13th stand is a culling mechanism, something that uses the hunting tradition to remove the hunters who are not paying attention, who will follow a lane into something they don't understand. The blood trail that leads the wrong way is a test. The section in Grayson County is a protected reserve, and the hunters of the county have been respecting that reserve for 35 years without being told to." She said it with the flat precision of a scientist describing a system she had studied. "We are part of the system," I said. "We have always been part of the system," she said. "We just didn't know it. We came to these mountains and we started hunting them, and we thought we were the hunters and the deer were the hunted, and the mountains were the neutral terrain between us.
But the mountains were never neutral. The mountains have their own hunters, their own prey, their own management objectives, and we have been hunting inside that system on those terms, whether we understood it or not. She was quiet for a moment. The ones who pay attention, she said, the ones who follow the blood trail and know when it's wrong, who trust their lead dog when the dog says go, who look through the old glass and see what the glass has always shown, who sit still when the turkey calls after dark, those hunters are the ones the mountains keep. The ones who don't pay attention, who follow every lane and answer every call and press past every sign that says this is not yours, those are the ones the mountains work on. The system has rules, I said. The system has always had rules, she said. The hunting tradition has always had rules. We thought the rules were ours. They're older than ours. They were here before we were. And the hunters who've been following them for generations, the ones who built camps with 4 rules written by founders who knew something terrible, who learned the ridge from their fathers and their fathers before them, those hunters have been following the mountains' rules all along, whether they knew it or not. She picked up her coffee cup. The empty season of 1987 was not a harvest failure. It was a correction. Something in these mountains decided that the northeastern section needed to be left alone, needed to be taken out of human hunting rotation, and it made that decision known to 81 hunters in the most direct way available. It made every deer in that section look wrong enough that not one of those hunters was willing to pull the trigger. And they listened, I said. They listened without being told why, without being given a rule or a tradition or a founding member's supplementary record. They listened because they were paying attention, and because paying attention was enough. She set down her coffee. That, she said, is what hunting in these mountains has always been, paying attention, not just to the deer, to the whole system, to the rules you can see and the ones you can only feel, to the lanes that are too perfect, and the calls that are too consistent, and the blood that is too even, and the eyes that are too full. She looked at the window. Pay attention, she said. That is the whole thing. That has always been the whole thing.
We came to these mountains with our rifles and our hounds and our tree stands and our blood trails and our first deer and our inherited glass and our camping traditions and our shed hunting routes. We came here, and we hunted. We thought that made us the hunters. We were hunting in a system that was already running, a system that had been running since before we arrived, that had its own hunters, its own management, its own rules, older than ours, rooted deeper than ours, written into the terrain itself rather than into any charter or regulation. A system that had been watching us since the first of us walked into this timber, that had been making room for us in its own way, on its own terms, that had been correcting us when we went wrong and protecting us when we paid attention and testing us, always testing us, to see whether we were the kind of hunters it could work with. The hunters of Grayson County passed the test in 1987. They went into a section where the deer were not available, and they looked at those deer, and they did not shoot. Nobody told them not to. They knew. The founding members of Camp 4 passed the test in 1931. They wrote the rule down. They passed it forward for 90 years. Ed Vance passed the test on the ridgeline above Rural Retreat. Cole Dressler passed the test on the bench above Combs Creek. Luther Phelps passed the test on the Fancy Gap Ridge. May Sutherland passed the test in the thicket in the rain. Ray Pruitt failed the test on the north-facing slope, and then he passed it, because he told the story to the next warden, because passing the knowledge forward is its own kind of passing. The mountains are not empty. They have never been empty. They are full, more full than any of us can measure, with things that have been here longer than our tradition and that will be here after our tradition is gone. Things that do not wish us harm. Things that do not wish us well in any sense we fully understand.
things that have their own purpose and their own management and their own claim on this ground, and that have been extending to us, generation after generation, the same courtesy they ask of us. Pay attention. Follow the rules. Know when a deer is not entirely a deer. Know when a lane is too perfect. Know when the blood trail is made rather than fallen. Know when to sit still in the dark and not answer. Know what the glass shows that the naked eye cannot. Know when your lead dog says go. Pay attention. That is what these mountains have always asked of us. That is the oldest rule. That is the one rule that contains all the others. The deer are in the timber, the hounds are in the drainage, the stands are on the ridge, and something older than all of it is in the canopy above you right now, watching, as it has always been watching, to see whether you are paying attention. Virginia Blood and Bone. 10 stories, 1 truth. Pay attention.
10 stories, 1 series. Virginia Blood and Bone is complete. If you have been with us from the 13th stand all the way to the empty season, thank you. From the deepest part of this fire, from the bottom of every cold morning in every stand we have sat in together, thank you. You paid attention. That matters. That is the whole thing. Leave me a comment below. Tell me which story stayed with you longest. Tell me which one found you at 3 in the morning and wouldn't let go. Tell me whether you have been in the field since and found yourself looking at the timber a little differently, listening to the morning with a little more attention, thinking twice about lanes that are too perfect and calls that come from the wrong direction. If you are new here and this is your first story, go back. Start at the 13th stand. They build. They were always building toward this. Subscribe. Share this with the hunter in your life who pays attention. We are not done with these mountains. There are more stories in the timber than 10 can hold. The fire is still going. It has never gone out. Go hunting. Pay attention. And whatever you find in the stand or the thicket or the grove or the lane, look at it carefully before you decide what to do. Look at the eyes. Listen to the dogs. Follow the rules you don't understand. And remember that you are not the only hunter in these mountains. You have never been the only hunter in these mountains.